In this talk, we introduce the model-based design of closed-loop deep brain stimulation controller using reinforcement learning. We are from Department of Electrical and Computer Engineering and Department of Biomedical Engineering from Duke University. This work is motivated by the fact that the Parkinson's disease is the second prevalent disease that affects motor functions. And currently, there are 1 million people in the US are affected by the Parkinson's disease, where this number is expected to reach 1.3 million by the next decade. Treatment of PD is very costly for both governments and patients. We can see that the government spends 25 billion every year out of the fiscal budget, while in the meantime, each individual patient is paying $2,500 to $100,000 for the treatment. And deep brain stimulation is now the only effective treatment that can alleviate PD symptoms. So currently, commercial DBS kit includes electrodes, a pulse generator, and a remote controller, where the electrodes are implanted into the basal ganglia part of the brain to deliver electric pulses generated by the pulse generator. Some stimulation parameters, such as pulse width, period, and amplitude, can be adjusted by clinicians and then programmed into the remote controller. Surgeries are necessary to implant the pulse generator into chest, and usually 2 to 4 electrodes are placed in the basal ganglia. In most of the cases, the stimulation remains on all the time, 24/7, stimulated at 180 Hz, which is energy inefficient and dramatically reduces battery life. Because of this, the pulse generator needs to be taken out for a battery swap every 2 to 4 years, where the surgery needs to be performed again. And this is part of the reason why the deep brain stimulation treatment is usually very costly for patients. And recently, there are also adaptive deep brain stimulation methods that allows the physicians to configure the stimulation parameters, such as frequency or amplitude, to adjust to different clinical states across patients. However, the parameter selection procedure is time-consuming for both patients and clinicians, as they have to analyze the disease pathology manually along with a few testing sessions later for fine-tuning. But in contrast, what we are trying to propose in this work is to have a controller that is trouble-free, which means it can learn to stimulate the best parameters by itself. Let's see how does deep brain stimulation work. So, DBS mostly work with 4 regions in the basal ganglia. They are STN, GPE, GPI, and thalamus. We place electrodes into GPI or STN to stimulate, while the stimulation pulses are formulated as square waves as shown from the top right of the figure, where usually the stimulation frequency is 180 Hz in the commercial devices, and it can be seen as several of the exactly same waves concatenated to each other. It does well to bring the neuron activities back to normal, but as we just discussed, it's energy consuming even if a lower frequency or amplitude is used. So in this work, we are trying to look into this issue from another perspective, which is to design a controller that can stimulate with different pulse patterns instead of just simply stacking up square waves. And in this way, the stimulator can effectively alleviate PD symptoms and reduce battery consumption at the same time. To detect neuron activities, electrodes are placed in the GPI and thalamus regions, where then the local field potentials are recorded to reflect neuron activations. Note that neurons in STN, GPE, and GPI are always active, meaning that firings can be detected at any time in these regions. But thalamus neurons don't usually fire unless in response to SMC input. So what happens in the basal ganglia when DBS is activated? Here we show electrical activity in GPI and thalamus with and without the stimulation. In normal brain, both GPI and thalamus firings are equally spaced and are around the same amplitude, as shown in the first column of the figure. In brain with Parkinson's disease, firings in GPI are no longer equally spaced, and it can cause extra firings or missing firings in thalamus region, as shown in the second column of the figure. Once deep brain stimulation is applied, we can see that both GPI and thalamus firings go back to normal condition, as shown from the third column. We can also see from here that the 180 Hz stimulation causes overly dense firings in the GPI region, which is unnecessary. And this is also a reason why we are trying to explore the possibilities of stimulating with different pulse patterns instead of just tweaking with the stimulation frequencies.
To capture the severity of Parkinson's disease, as well as quality of control of the DBS policy, we introduced two commonly used metrics that can quantify the severity of the PD effect. The first one is error index, which is defined as the ratio of erroneous firings in thalamus in response to SMC inputs. And the second one is beta power spectral density, which is the 13 to 35 Hz power spectral density of the GPI neuron potential. The PD can increase both of the EI and P beta as shown in the two graphs from the bottom. But what are the limitations of existing DBS? First, the existing commercial DBS device is patient agnostic, may cause several side effects such as speech impairment, and is energy inefficient. Then, in the open loop setting, patients need to be done surgery every 2 to 4 years to replace the battery. Now it's important to develop the closed loop controller that is patient specific, energy efficient, and can reduce side effects. So there are some existing works that can address these issues. The first category is adaptive DBS, which can turn on or off or change DBS stimulation frequency or amplitude according to local field potential readings. But they only follows the protocols that are pre-configured by physicians each time at a clinical appointment. Even if the stimulation parameters can be changed, usually the options are limited. For example, the frequency can only be 180 Hz or 130 Hz, etc. Every time the patient clinical state changes, it needs to be reprogrammed by the physician. It's energy inefficient because it still stimulates at high frequency, and most time the stimulation lasts very long. There are also some other reinforcement-based methods that can learn to adjust stimulation parameters online. But still, there are only sets of pre-selected parameter combinations can be used. And it's also patient agnostic because only periodic stimulation is used. So in this work, we propose a deep reinforcement-based controller that is energy efficient and have substantial stimulation options, since we don't just change the stimulation parameters such as frequencies or amplitudes, we also change the stimulation pulse pattern for each patient. And also, the controller we designed do not need any pre-configurations. And it's patient-specific because the controller can select the pulse pattern that work best for each patient. So, the focus of this work is how to design deep brain stimulation controllers to provide effective and efficient patient-specific stimulation. Very effective in terms of alleviating effect of PD symptoms, and energy efficient means to reducing the stimulation frequency as much as possible. And we propose a flexible and scalable model-driven design framework for learning-based control. First, we convert the basal ganglia into a computational model according to an existing work, where the dynamics of each region in the basal ganglia is modeled using partial differential equations, and the neuron firings over time can be calculated from the model. Qualitative control matrix are then can be computed as the output of the model. Then, in our previous publications, we designed a hardware implementation of the basal ganglia model that can simulate the brain in real time. Now, what we do here is develop an entire brain-on-chip platform to simulate the dynamics in the basal ganglia area with a reinforcement controller incorporated, where the BGM provides the data to train the RL engine, and the communications between the two modules are done through the DBS device, where in one direction, it executes the control inputs suggested by the RL engine, and in the other direction, it gathers training data from the BGM and sends them to the RL engine. This can provide us real-time computations of quality of control matrix, unlimited experimental data, and safe trials. We develop a framework that will facilitate design of novel DBS controllers and testing of the existing ones. Fidelity and desired application are mapped into corresponding brain model with appropriate inputs and outputs. And then Simulink and LabVIEW modules can be used for testing response to novel controller inputs. When hardware is used, this can be performed in real time, allowing for hardware-in-the-loop accelerated execution and testing of existing DBS devices. Here's a recap on how the basal ganglia model is implemented computationally. It's captured as a network of nonlinear hybrid automata synchronizing to capture the evolution of neural electrical potentials. The neural connectivity and SMAC source are randomized to simulate different brain structures across patients. In practice, the BGM can be executed either in a software only or a hardware in the loop setting. So for software, it's easy to use and it can be run in multi-core manner to run several simulations at a time. And for the hardware setting, it runs faster computations in real time and can be adapted to experiments with animals or humans. To synthesize a controller that is patient-specific, effective, and energy efficient, we propose a reinforcement-based approach to solve it. First, the basal ganglia model is converted to a Markov decision process. Then, it is formulated as a reinforcement problem, which is then solved by an actor critic. The training and the testing is done entirely on the brain-on-chip platform that we designed. Now, we introduce how to convert the basal ganglia model into a Markov decision process. The state space are defined as sequences of error index and Bayesian power within a window. For actions, instead of just tweaking parameters such as frequencies or amplitudes in existing methods, we actually stimulate different patterns for each patient. We represent the stimulation as vectors of zeros and ones, where 1 indicates that the pulse should be stimulated and 0 otherwise. Transition probabilities are determined by the initial states of the neurons, which is unknown. A practical analogy of this would be different brains respond to stimulations in different ways. And we also define a determinist policy for a MDP as a function that maps from the states to actions.
Given the Markov decision process, we now introduce how do we formulate the deep brain stimulation controller synthesis as a reinforcement problem and how to solve it.
So now we can formulate our problem as given a Markov decision process with unknown transition probabilities and a stimulation frequency that is lower than some threshold that limits the energy cost. We wanted to synthesize a policy that minimizes the effect of Parkinson's disease. First, we define reward functions over the MDP, given the current state st, the action A, and the next state st plus 1. We give a large positive reward if both error index and Bayesian power at the same time is below some threshold, and a small positive reward if one of the two metrics goes over its threshold. At last, we give a negative reward if both error index and baseband power are above that threshold. And by using this reward function, we can calculate the accumulated return. So now, given the Markov decision process and the cumulative returns, we can formulate a reinforcement problem. And consider the large search space as where the actions are defined as a sequence of zeros and ones with length of the stimulation window. The permutation results in 2 to the power of the length options. So we explored the use of actor-critic algorithms, which are originally designed for solving control problems in continuous space. So specifically, the deep actor-critic learning algorithm contains two major parts, the actor network and the critic network. The actor network produces actions given states, while critic network evaluates the expected return or Q values for specific SA pairs. The critic network updates itself following the Q learning schema. Specifically, its weights at the training step t plus 1 is assigned to the weights at the previous training step t, plus the learning rate times the immediate return delta t times the gradient of the neural network output, which represents the Q function. The actor network updates itself according to a Pajic gradient mechanism, where part of this gradients comes from the critic network. So now a challenge appears. Given that the states are represented by sequences of error index and baseband power over a window, how do we actually deal with the inputs in the form of time sequences? So first, in the actor network, we formulate the states as two-channel vectors, which are analogous to the RGB channels in images. We're doing this because we expect the following convolutional layers can capture the relation between the two quality of control matrix as well as the changes of two matrices over time. Now another challenge appears. So how do we actually discretize the output into zeros and ones given the outputs of the fully connected layer are all in real number space? To address this, we designed the following multi-dimensional softmax layers to produce the indices of paths within the stimulation window. So for example, if the stimulation window is 6, then a vector of 1, 3, 5 corresponds to the stimulation where the first, third, and the fifth elements is 1, and 0 otherwise. For the critic network, we input the state in the same form, and then follows by the convolutional and the fully connected layers. But at the end, we concatenate with the actions suggested by the actor network. So this way we can obtain the Q values for the state action pairs.
And now we introduce how to practically train and evaluate the performance of the reinforcement controller with our brain-on-chip platform.
So the reinforcement controller is trained using the brain-on-chip platform that we designed, where the following hyperparameters are selected to be having the best performance. So both the sampling window and the stimulation window are set as 2 seconds. The maximum stimulation frequency of our controller is 45 Hz. In this setting, we are saving 70% of the energy compared to the 180 Hz stimulation using the commercial devices, while the maximum number of training episodes is set to be 250, with 50 steps in each one of the episodes. As usual, the actor learning rate is 1 to the negative third, and the critical learning rate is selected to be 0.01. As we can see from the reward episode plot, the learning algorithm starts converging after 80 episodes of training and finds the optimal stimulation control policy after 200 episodes of training. We apply the reinforcement controller on a PD brain model to evaluate the performance. The equivalent frequency of our stimulation is 45 Hz, meaning that for all the patterns we stimulate, there are at most 45 pulses in 1 second. So we select a periodic controller that stimulates at the same 45 Hz frequency as one of the baselines, while the other is the 180 Hz periodic stimulations that is used in the commercial devices. It can be seen from both of these plots that our controller pushes both the air index and the baseband power way more underneath the 45 Hz periodic controller, which prove that the reinforcement-based controller can effectively alleviate PD symptoms by searching in the stimulation pattern space and picking up the pattern that work best for each individual patient. Although it can be seen that the 180 Hz controller eliminates all erroneous firings and pushes both the air index and beta power to be very small, it causes 4 times of the energy as our reinforcement-based controller. So in general, we achieve the effectiveness almost the same as the 180 Hz stimulator, but dramatically reduces the energy cost by 70%. Also, by observing the neural activations in the thalamus region, it confirms that the effectiveness of the reinforcement controller. So specifically, if you look at all the red boxes, our controller brings most of the erroneous firings that happens in the 45 Hz periodic controller back to normal, which is only 10% less than the 180 Hz stimulator. So we propose a model-based reinforcement design using the brain-on-chip platform that emulates the basal ganglia regions in real time. And the deep reinforcement-based DBS controller we designed is energy efficient, treatment effective, patient-specific, and don't require any pre-configurations. And now we are evaluating our controller on animal models or human trials. Thank you.